Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into a world where the clatter of sandals on mosaic floors echoes through vast marble corridors, where everything smells faintly of beeswax, ink, and aging parchment, and where the fate of an empire might hinge on whether your handwriting is legible. Welcome to the Byzantine bureaucracy, the real engine of the Eastern Roman Empire, more enduring than any general and far more caffeinated. You're not a noble or a soldier or a grand vizier tonight. You're a clerk. And not just any clerk, you've just landed a coveted post in the great palace of Constantinople. You'll need a steady hand, good posture, and a stomach that doesn't mind cold lentils 3 times a day. Also, hope you brought your own goose quills. Rationing's been tight this month. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And, while we're here in the candlelit calm of the Eastern Roman Empire, drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is for you. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge across marble and sandals that really weren't made for long shifts. The guards at the bronze gate nod you through, barely glancing up from their dice game. Behind you, Constantinople hums, fishermen calling out at the harbor, someone selling honey cakes, and the occasional bray of a mule hauling firewood up a slippery slope. But in here, it's all wax seals, parchment bundles, and whispered secrets. You follow the scent of fresh ink. It's surprisingly pungent, vinegar, iron, a hint of something like musty plums. That's the signature smell of Pharaoh-Gallic ink, the pride of Byzantine scribes. Historians still argue whether this exact formula originated in Constantinople or was borrowed from earlier Roman chemists. But what's clear is that no other empire treated ink like a state secret quite the way Byzantium did. The palace office you enter is more hive than room. Long benches, stacked scrolls, scribes hunched over their work like monks. Someone sneezes and a stack of wax tablets tumbles over. No one reacts. Typical Thursday. Your supervisor, a thin man who looks like he hasn't slept since the last patriarch died, waves you over. He gives you a sheaf of orders and a pot of ink. Don't spill, he mutters, like it's a personal insult he's already bracing for. You take a seat beside a man who's humming tunelessly and drawing tiny lions in the margins of a diplomatic letter. Your task? Copy a tax edict from the Armenian provinces. And it has to be exact, punctuation and all. Mistakes aren't just embarrassing, they can be legally binding. Once, they say, a scribe accidentally doubled the grain tithe for an entire province. The governor there was not amused. Neither were the peasants, who staged a minor rebellion. Ink errors were no joke. As your hand starts to move across the... Eventually, he just hands you another sheet of parchment and says, "Try again. This time, breathe through your mouth." You sigh. The palace smells like parchment, yes, but also like deadlines and desperation. Welcome to the Byzantine civil service. Your second attempt at the Armenian tax edict is coming along nicely. The ink has thickened just a little in the cooling air, perfect for bold, decisive strokes. You ease your hand down the page, careful not to smudge, and try not to think about the pile of scrolls waiting behind you. The stack wobbles like an ambitious baklava tower. The man next to you hums again, same tune, still not in key. You glance around and realize something. Everything in this room, from the inkwells to the sandals to the little stool that pinches your hip, is here in service of one thing: paperwork. Byzantium, the mighty Eastern Roman Empire, is addicted to it, obsessively, relentlessly, joylessly. It's not just tax edicts. It's wheat rations, monk rosters, fish deliveries, reports from naval spies in Crete, temple inventories, and those weird letters from bishops who always seem to be arguing about whether a particular saint's relics smell holy enough. There are rumors, in fact, that a Byzantine official once documented a village goat census down to the color of each goat's hooves. Historians still argue whether this level of detail was due to administrative genius or sheer boredom. And if you think a missing scroll means you can just wing it, think again. One misplaced seal, one unsigned decree, and you'll be called to the Hippolyta's office faster than you can say imperial reprimand. The last guy who misplaced a shipment form for Antioch's olives was reassigned to pigeon coop cleaning duty. Those pigeons are not polite. You pause for a moment to flex your wrist. A younger scribe across from you is squinting hard at a papyrus sheet, trying to make sense of some older colleague's atrocious handwriting. It's a common complaint. The empire may span continents, but apparently not everyone got the memo on standardized cursive. Which brings us to one of the strangest features of this entire system, the stationary panic. See, parchment is expensive. It comes from animal hides, usually sheep or goats, and takes an absurd amount of time to produce. It's soft, durable, and gloriously smooth when well made, but the price is steep. Papyrus is cheaper, imported from Egypt, and great for short-term use. Problem is, it doesn't last well in Constantinople's damp winters. Humidity makes it curl like fried onion skins. So, every time there's a shipment delay, say due to bandits in Cilicia or a storm in the Aegean, the scribes start to panic. Not visibly, of course. This is still the empire. But it begins with
You've seen it happen. One morning, the treasury clerks mysteriously have an extra bundle of parchment, and suddenly the bishop's office is missing theirs. A coincidence? Sure. And the emperor just writes his laws in the dirt with a stick. The real crisis, however, is when even wax tablets start running low. These are the empire's equivalent of sticky notes, simple wooden boards coated in black and beeswax, scratched with styluses for temporary notes. They're supposed to be reusable, but overzealous scribes sometimes gouge them too deep. Write like you're whispering, your trainer had said, not shouting. In desperate times, scribes resort to palimpsests, old parchment pages that get scraped and reused. You've done it. Carefully erasing a faded theological treatise just to reuse the page for a shipping invoice. There's something mildly scandalous about writing cabbage weights over the faint ghost of St. Basil's sermons. And yet, the empire insists on it. Every turnip counted, every soldier paid, every monk accounted for. The Byzantine world doesn't just run on law and religion, it runs on receipts. Some scholars think this obsession with documentation is what allowed Byzantium to survive long after the Western Roman Empire collapsed. Rome fell to chaos and invaders. Byzantium? It made you fill out a form in triplicate before collapsing. As you keep writing, you notice your ink is starting to go watery. You tilt the pot slightly. Yep, condensation. The nearby brazier is warming the room unevenly again, and now your iron gall ink is separating. It's fixable, though. You grab the stirring twig and give it a few lazy swirls, watching the little vortex swirl like a dark whirlpool. Across the room, a scribe lets out a mild shriek. "Mold! Again!" he groans. That's right, ink can mold, and when it does, the smell is indescribable, like vinegar, sadness, and spoiled fig jam. The culprit? Improperly stored oak galls, or sometimes just bad luck. Once mold sets in, it's not just gross, it's useless. Moldy ink can gum up your quill or eat through parchment. No one wants to read an imperial decree where half the letters look like they've been chewed by rats. Luckily, there's a solution. Sort of. You reach for your little pouch of dried myrrh. Not for your skin, though that's a nice perk. It's a standard anti-mold additive for ink. Crushed and stirred in, it helps preserve your precious recipe. The empire may stretch from the Adriatic to Armenia, but without this strange black soup in your pot, it all starts to unravel. Of course, the recipe varies by region. Some scribes add iron sulfate too early and ruin the texture. Others substitute nut galls when oak isn't available, leading to a lighter, more reddish ink that officials in Constantinople quietly frown upon. And there's always that one guy, there's always one, who swears his family has an ancient recipe handed down since Constantine. You've tried his ink. It smells like burnt olives and dries like tar. But nobody tells him that. A quiet horn blows in the courtyard. Not a call to arms, just the lunch bell. You set your quill down, stretch your fingers, and join the slow exodus of hunched figures filing out into the sun. On the steps, someone's selling sesame rolls. You buy one, still warm, and eat it while looking out at the city. Domes shimmer in the distance. Laundry flaps lazily between buildings. Somewhere, a cat is yowling in protest at the pigeon stealing his fish scraps. Then the bell chimes again. Back to your desk. The scroll pile hasn't gotten smaller. The ink hasn't stopped thickening, and the empire isn't going to document itself.
You sit down again, fingers faintly sticky from sesame seeds, and glance at the pile awaiting your attention. The top scroll is slightly curled from humidity, and the wax seal has cracked. You smooth it with the side of your hand, dip your quill, and begin transcribing a land dispute between two monasteries in Cappadocia, apparently involving a donkey, a wine cellar, and an extremely aggressive goose. Classic, but you're distracted by something more delicate, more subtle, something almost magical, if magic smelled like rust and vinegar. Ink. Today's batch is holding up well, thanks to the extra myrrh. But not all ink behaves so nicely, and not all ink was made to last.
You see, not all documents in Byzantium were meant to be permanent. That's right. Some were made to disappear. Literally. The empire developed two distinct classes of ink, one for eternity and one for plausible deniability. You pause and swirl your pot slowly, watching the color shift slightly as it settles. What you're using is ferro-Gallic, a dark, iron-rich ink that bites into the page. Once dry, it's there for good. But there's another kind, sometimes called lamp black ink, made with soot and gum. It sits on the surface like a guest that's not sure whether to stay. All it takes is a damp cloth, or in more covert situations, a whispered breath of lemon juice, and it's gone. Historians still argue whether these disappearing inks were used more for innocent drafts or more nefarious motives. Some think they were just temporary tools, notes to be recopied later. Others suspect intrigue, secret messages between eunuchs, quiet edits to troublesome charters, a bit of courtly revisionism. It's not hard to believe. This is Byzantium, after all, the place where one bureaucrat once tried to erase a rival's name from an entire property record by dotting ink over it in a matching color. The ruse lasted about a week, until sunlight revealed the fraud, and the culprit was reassigned to the Ministry of Sewer Reports. A fate worse than exile. You dip again and feel a soft tug from the ink's texture, thicker now. That's the trouble with iron gall. Over time, it darkens and corrodes. In fact, some of the oldest Byzantine manuscripts have ghostly outlines where the ink has literally eaten into the page like invisible termites. Preservationists today call it ink burn. You, meanwhile, just call it job security. The formula you've memorized, though technically it's supposed to be secret, is equal parts science and superstition. Oak galls crushed and soaked, iron sulfate, also called vitriol, mixed in with vinegar, gum arabic for binding, and water to dilute. Some add wine, some use urine. Yes, really. And some just wing it with whatever smells strong enough to scare off mold. The result is temperamental, beautiful, and occasionally explosive if stored in the wrong container. One old clerk swore his ink pot burst during Lent. A sign, he declared, from Saint Cyril. You're not so sure. But you do know that imperial edicts, those gloriously purple-signed documents of final authority, never use iron gall. That's because imperial ink, used by the emperor himself or his highest officials, is a different beast altogether. Purple. Glorious. Secret. We'll get to that soon. For now, you're writing on lambskin parchment, smooth as glass and faintly pink under the flickering oil lamps. The letters flow gently from your hand. Byzantine unseal, the preferred rounded style, designed for clarity and control. Cursive is faster but frowned upon for anything serious, and what you're copying is very serious. The land boundaries of two monastic vineyards disputed for over 70 years. Apparently, there was an incident involving a fire, an unauthorized fig tree, and a bishop who swore he saw a miracle goat. You do your best not to smirk. In this job, emotion is a liability. One poorly timed laugh and you'll blot the margins, and no one wants to explain to the archdeacon why his holy decree has a tiny cartoon sunburst next to the word abstain. You dip again, and notice the ink is leaving a slight sheen. That's good. It means it's binding properly, especially important in this draft, which will be sealed and sent to the imperial chancery. If it holds up, it will join the thousands of other scrolls winding their way through the empire's veins, across Anatolia, through Syria, down to the Peloponnese, and even into Egypt, where Byzantine influence still lingers in churches and tax stations. You sit back for a moment, hand cramping. Across the room, someone mutters a prayer before beginning a copy of a legal digest. You catch a few words, something about Saint Theodora interceding so his ink won't smear today. It's oddly comforting. You reach into your pouch and pull out your lucky ink stirrer, an old sliver of olive wood with a tiny knot shaped like a fish at one end. Technically, it's just a stick, but you swear your lines come out smoother when you use it. Superstition? Probably. But in a world where imperial bureaucrats used astrology to time their filing deadlines, your fish stick is practically modern. Someone nearby lets out a low groan. The ink's turned again, he says, staring glumly at a watery black puddle that smells faintly of sour milk. His apprentice scuttles off for a replacement batch. You can't help but feel a little smug. Yours is perfect today. And here's a secret they don't tell the new scribes. Ink tells stories. Not just through the letters it forms, but in how it behaves. A panicked decree scratched in slanted, faded ink, probably written in haste during a siege. A careful contract in deep, glossy black, negotiated at leisure, perhaps over fruit and honey wine. You've started to recognize the moods of the writers just from the ink. Rage has sharp strokes and dried edges. Doubt has pauses, tiny dots where the quill hesitated. You take another slow breath, straighten your spine, and begin again. On this day, under the reign of our most serene Lord Basil. You barely notice the city humming beyond the windows. In this quiet chamber of slow ink and slower thoughts, you are part of something ancient, something delicate, something profoundly boring, and oddly beautiful. The scroll in your hands is nearly finished, the edges curled slightly, your ink strokes drying into a crisp, steady brown. You sit back, exhale quietly, and inspect your work for smudges, missing diacritics, or, heaven forbid, a duplicated amen. The palace once issued 2 separate decrees involving a tax forgiveness that accidentally contradicted itself, all because someone added a flourish to the wrong saint's name. But what really catches your attention now is the tiny ink recipe tucked into the margin of a different scroll, carefully obscured under shorthand markings. It's not supposed to be there. Recipes like that are typically memorized, shared only in whispers between high-ranking scribes or passed down like family heirlooms. And yet, here it is, scratched in faint script beside a livestock report. You lean in. Crushed galls soaked for 3 moons, a bit of iron scraped from old blades, a single drop of rosewater for the smell, the note claims. It ends cryptically. Do not stir clockwise, lest the batch sour like envy. Right, because nothing says administrative excellence like emotionally unstable ink. Ink recipes were the pride of the Byzantine civil offices. Everyone had one, or wanted one. They were traded like wine secrets, with plenty of posturing. One senior eunuch insisted he used ink aged in clay pots buried under fig trees. Another swore by adding a shaving of dried squid ink for imperial undertones. Historians still argue whether these strange variations had actual merit or were just bureaucratic flexes, like bringing your own goblet to a communal wine tasting. What's certain is that ink recipes were often written in coded language to keep them from wandering into the wrong hands, like the hands of rival departments, or worse, the monks. You've seen one of those codes before, a seemingly normal letter with extra dots and dashes inserted above certain vowels. If decoded correctly, it reveals an entirely different message, usually proportions for ingredients or precise boiling times. If decoded incorrectly, well, you end up with ink that smells like foot wraps and dries like spoiled resin. The alchemy of ink wasn't just superstition. The Byzantine ink makers, officially called melanographi, which translates to black writers, often had training in rudimentary chemistry. They understood that different metals reacted differently with tannins, that vinegar from different regions affected color and longevity, that even the humidity of a room changed the texture of the final brew. And then there were the disasters. You remember one story passed around by candlelight your first week in the chancery. A scribe from Thessaloniki tried to brew a midnight ink with lamp soot and wine lees. It turned purple, then bright green, then promptly exploded when stored in a sealed amphora. The ceiling of that scriptorium still has a faint chartreuse stain. You dip your own stylus into a less volatile mixture and begin copying a legal proclamation. The ink glides easily, the color bold and true. Yours is a textbook ferrogallic blend: oak gall, iron sulfate, gum, arabic, and patience. Simmered over low heat, stirred with a goose feather. Not too showy, not too dull. Your mentor always said the true test of a good ink is whether it listens to your thoughts. A bit dramatic, sure, but after weeks of handling different blends, you begin to believe it. Some inks just fight you. They clump, they drag, they rebel against thin parchment. Others seem to know where you're going before your hand gets there. That's what this one feels like. The day's scrolls take shape around you. Land disputes, grain tallies, a letter to a bishop requesting clarification on a disputed saint's feast day. Apparently, a feast was held too early and now nobody knows if they've fasted properly. You write it all without question. After all, you're the messenger, not the philosopher. But your fingers start to itch for a little flair. Just one line. So, in the corner of one scroll, nearly hidden beneath the colophon, you draw a small leaf. Nothing elaborate, just a flourish. Your mark. It's not allowed, of course, but you've heard tales that a few scribes, famous ones even, sneaked symbols or signatures into their work, leaving behind little fingerprints across time. One left tiny owl sketches in the margins of religious codices. Another encoded his initials into the rhythm of the lettering. You like to think of it as joining a long, quiet lineage of bureaucratic rebels. A scraping sound pulls your attention, a colleague beside you sanding down a dry ink blot with fine pumice. "Spilled again," he mutters, not looking up. "It's these new pots, too shallow." You glance at the ink pot in question and raise an eyebrow. It's a wide bronze bowl, more ornamental than practical, probably requisitioned by a scribe with delusions of grandeur. It looks good, sure, but when it comes to actual writing, deep and narrow is best. Helps preserve the ink's consistency. The wider the surface, the faster it oxidizes. Basic chemistry. Or, as your mentor phrased it, showy pots, shallow thoughts. You suppress a smile and return to your scroll.
You're starting to appreciate the strange intimacy of ink making. It's more than mixing ingredients. It's touch, timing, smell. It's knowing when a batch has turned sour by the way it clinks to your quill. It's trusting your wrist more than your eyes. It's burning a few failures, sometimes literally, and starting again. You reach the end of the scroll and blow gently across the final line, watching the ink settle into the fibers of the page. This one will last. It might outlive you and your children, and maybe even the empire itself. Unless, of course, someone gets creative with a palimpsest knife in 200 years. You fold it neatly and press it into the outgoing basket. The supervisor passes by, nodding faintly. You don't say anything. But you notice he's holding a new recipe, written in shorthand, folded 4 times, and sealed with wax. He drops it on your desk as he passes. No words, just a glance. You reach for it with ink-stained fingers. The future, after all, is written in layers. The sealed note sits on your desk like a sleeping cat, quiet, unassuming, yet full of potential chaos. You hesitate for a second before breaking the wax seal, careful not to crack it too harshly. It crumbles delicately between your fingers, revealing tightly folded parchment inside. The script is minuscule and neat, probably copied with a squirrel hair brush dipped in a thinned-down blend of soot ink. Whoever wrote this had both skill and an excess of free time. You squint at the lines. It's another recipe, of course, but this one's different. More precise. Specific ratios. Unusual ingredients. Vinegar, yes. oak gall powder naturally, but also dried violet petals, crushed snail shells, a single drop of seawater per 4 drams of iron. You lean back in your chair. Somewhere behind you, a scribe sneezes loudly, causing a nearby inkwell to tip. Muttered curses follow. You ignore them. This recipe is interesting, experimental, possibly insane. Exactly the kind of thing that makes the Byzantine civil service more fun than it has any right to be, and you know exactly where to test it. The ink room. It's not an official part of the chancery floor plan, just a cramped, dim chamber tucked behind the corridor of outdated tax scrolls. Technically, it's meant for supply storage, but everyone knows it's where the serious ink-making happens. You grab your tools, pestle, vial, some aged vinegar, and sneak away, clutching the recipe like it's a love letter. The ink room smells like 5 centuries of bad decisions. Vinegar, mildew, wax drippings, and the faint metallic tang of iron. A single high window casts a wedge of dusty light across a shelf of aging pots. You pick your ingredients carefully, measuring them with a precision that would make your old tutor nod solemnly. Crushed oak galls first, ground into a soft, bitter-smelling powder. Then the iron filings, scraped from a rusted horseshoe because this empire doesn't waste. You drop in the dried violets, frivolous but strangely poetic. Then comes the seawater, stolen from a half-dried amphora labeled "Do Not Drink," noted. You heat the mixture slowly, stirring counterclockwise, not clockwise, as the old margin note had warned, lest you summon the bureaucratic equivalent of a storm cloud. A thin steam rises. It smells not entirely awful. Earthy, almost floral. For a moment you wonder if you've accidentally created scented ink, a niche product perhaps? Historians still argue whether Byzantine ink makers deliberately experimented with fragrance as a way to denote social class. Some theories suggest that high-ranking court scribes, particularly eunuchs, used scented ink for correspondence to signal refinement. Others claim it was just a side effect of using poorly washed vessels. You let the mixture cool, then ladle a spoonful into a fresh inkwell. It gleams deep, blue-black with the faintest iridescent shimmer. You test it with a quick scribble on a wax tablet. The flow is smooth, the scent subtle, and miraculously it doesn't clump. Back at your desk, you carefully swap in the new ink for a routine job, a letter of thanks to the Bishop of Trebizond for continued ecclesiastical clarity, whatever that means. The strokes look richer, smoother. The ink seems to hover in the parchment, soaking in just enough to stay, but not so much as to bleed. You smile, just slightly. But not everyone is as pleased. Midway through the afternoon, the chief of records, an older man with a perpetual scowl and eyebrows like broom bristles, pauses at your desk. "That's new ink," he says flatly. You look up innocently. "Slight revision to the standard recipe, sir. Violet notes. Minimal iron." He raises one bristle. "Does it conform to protocol?" You pause. It dries quickly. He sniffs the air. "Too floral. People will think the bishop's being courted."
You quickly offer to recopy the letter with standard ink. He nods and moves on, leaving behind a faint trail of judgment. Still, you keep a small bottle of the violet batch hidden behind a stack of codices, just for you, just in case. Because here's the thing. Ink innovation, while frowned upon publicly, is often secretly admired. The scribes may be bound by rules, but every one of them is a little bit of a chemist, a little bit of a rebel. You once heard of a monk who made ink from crushed mulberries, only to discover it faded to gold in sunlight. He was banished for heresy. The scroll, however, now sits in the patriarch's private collection. As the sun slants lower and the oil lamps are trimmed for evening work, you hear whispers about a new directive from the imperial court, something involving the Sacrum Consistorium, the emperor's inner council. They want a fresh scroll copied overnight. 7 copies, actually, each sealed, signed, and dyed with official imperial ink. Ah, yes, the purple problem. You suppress a sigh. Because imperial purple ink isn't just rare, it's regulated. Only a few people in the entire palace are authorized to handle it,
and even then, it's locked in a small iron chest guarded by a eunuch who never blinks. The reason? Tyrian purple ink isn't made like normal ink. It involves secret ingredients, likely derived from murex snails, ground minerals, and something vaguely acidic that stains fingertips for weeks. Only the emperor and a handful of high-ranking officials may sign in purple. Forgeries are not just frowned upon, they're treason. Still, you've heard rumors that some ink makers try to replicate it with crushed berries, gold dust, and cinnamon extract, that one scribe once dyed his fingers purple just to feel powerful, that the real secret is not in the color, but the ritual behind the making, the chants, the oils, the precise lunar timing. Historians debate it endlessly. You, on the other hand, just worry about smudging. As the night draws in and the candles flicker low, you return to your familiar black ink. It dries matte, honest, slightly gritty. Not imperial, perhaps, but steady, dependable. The ink of the people who keep the gears turning. You dip your quill again and return to your work. A complaint from Antioch about missing olives. A marriage contract, third revision. A map annotation that someone's drawn with a slightly inappropriate lion. All of it flows now, and behind each letter your ink carries just a whisper of violet, a secret shared only with parchment, candlelight, and time. The lion sketch keeps staring at you. It's on the corner of a border map, lounging next to a depiction of the Euphrates, looking smug and anatomically suspicious. You don't know who drew it, probably the same junior cartographer who once illustrated Mount Ararat as a stack of pancakes, but you quietly decide not to erase it. Let future generations wonder if Byzantine lions had elbows like spaghetti. You return your attention to the day's real concern, the imperial purple ink request. By late evening, a hush falls across the chancery. Lamps glow low and the windows turn mirror black. The usual murmurs and rustlings are gone, replaced by the quiet shuffling of scribes, making themselves look busier than they feel. Because when imperial ink enters the room, things change. A eunuch arrives bearing a wooden case bound in bronze. He doesn't speak. He simply sets the box down on a central table, nods once, and disappears down the corridor. Inside the box, wrapped in lambskin and bound with a wax-stamped cord, is a tiny glass vial. It's no larger than your thumb, and it glows. Not literally, of course, but the color is unmistakable. A deep, regal purple, like crushed velvet soaked in mystery. You stand back and let the appointed copyist take over. His fingers tremble slightly as he opens the vial. You understand, everyone does. This is ink with consequences. The formula is top secret, guarded more closely than military plans. Most agree it starts with murex shellfish, tiny spiny creatures harvested from the eastern Mediterranean, especially around Phoenician shores. Their glands produce a foul-smelling secretion that, when oxidized and processed, turns purple. The amount needed for even a teaspoon of dye is staggering. Thousands of shellfish. Weeks of drying, probably a chant or two. But some historians still argue whether the ink used in court documents was true Tyrian purple or a synthetic blend created from minerals and plants. It's hard to say. Recipes weren't written down. They were passed from one eunuch to another, guarded like the emperor's passwords. You lean closer. The copyist is using a special reed pen, shorter and stiffer than your usual quill. It's less absorbent, designed to handle the viscosity of the imperial ink, which is thicker, slower to dry, and loaded with pigment. If applied too quickly, it beads on the surface and smears with a sigh. If too slowly, it sinks in and bleeds like a crushed berry. And the smell? Faintly metallic, like old coins dipped in seawater. You've only ever handled the real thing once, during your apprenticeship. A test signature never sent. You remember the way it clung to your hands for days, the stain refusing to fade no matter how many lemon rubs you tried. You could still see it in the moonlight, like a reminder you touched something that was not yours. Tonight, though, you're just a witness. The document is a reaffirmation of tax privileges granted to the monasteries around Mount Olympus. Monks there are permitted to collect grain, wine, and honey without penalty. They argue this was agreed upon by divine consultation. Though you suspect it had more to do with a particularly well-connected abbot and a barrel of bribes disguised as preserves. Still, the decree must be perfect. Each word clear, each flourish precise. The purple ink applied only to the emperor's name and final signature block shimmers as it dries. The candlelight dances on it like sunlight on deep water. You find yourself holding your breath. Then it's over. The copyist caps the vial, rewraps it in lambskin, and reseals the box. It vanishes the way it came, back into the guarded vaults of the palace. Silence resumes. The scribes stretch their fingers, shift in their seats, resume their ordinary black and brown script. But something has changed. For a moment, they were part of something sacred. Boring, yes, but sacred. You sit back down and reach for your regular ink. It looks dull now, almost apologetic. Still, there's comfort in the mundane. You go back to work, now copying a list of local amphora shapes. The imperial court has apparently issued a new standard for wine containers. All future amphorae used in state shipments must bear one of 5 approved silhouettes designated by regional codes. This is, technically, a wine registry, but it reads like a fashion manual for pottery. There's Thracian tallneck, favored in the north, Ionian pear, popular among coastal traders, Syrian belly jar, wide and squat, and then Cappadocian pinchback, which looks suspiciously like a chamber pot. The last is unnamed type E, described only as functionally sufficient. You write each one down with dutiful precision, though a part of you wants to sketch caricatures of the pots with legs and facial expressions. Maybe later, in the margins, with your violet ink. As the night grows heavier, your thoughts drift to the ink itself. Purple for emperors, black for scribes, red for corrections, gold, on rare occasions, for divine texts. Each color a hierarchy, each recipe a secret. It's not just writing, it's an unspoken language of power. You once saw a page illuminated with gold leaf, not ink, but actual flake-thin sheets pressed into wet adhesive. The script was ordinary, but the presentation, divine. It flickered in the candlelight like a whispered blessing. The gold didn't help the content. Some minor miracle of a saint who supposedly healed a cow, but it made it unforgettable.
That's the thing about ink in Byzantium. It wasn't just functional, it was emotional, symbolic, a message about who mattered, who had authority, who deserved permanence. You pause to stretch, fingers sore. The ink on your quill is beginning to thicken again. You stir the pot lazily, the scent of vinegar and tannin rising faintly. You wonder, not for the first time, what future historians will think of this bureaucracy. Will they marvel at its precision, laugh at its pettiness? Will they even be able to read it? Or will your scrolls crumble into dust while some future scholar speculates, wrongly, that Cappadocian pinchback was a musical instrument? You chuckle to yourself. The ink glides, the hours pass, the empire, asleep in marble halls, dreams on. And you? You keep writing. The candles are burning low now, their lights softening into amber puddles across the scriptorium floor. Your fingers move more slowly, but they're steady. The scroll before you is a customs report, terribly dull, unless you have an inexplicable fondness for counting sacks of lentils. You do not. But the ink is flowing well, the parchment is smooth, and the silence is oddly comforting. You've begun to notice patterns in the way people write under certain conditions. When the ink is too thick, their letters bunch together, panicked like sheep in a storm. When it's thin, the words stretch out, as if drifting downstream. You can tell how much sleep someone got the night before based solely on how many corrections they make in a single line. This one? Whoever wrote it was sleepy, full of dinner, and deeply bored with lentils. Still, someone has to transcribe it, and so you dip your quill, careful not to let the iron gall settle too long. Ink behaves differently in the final hours of the day. It thickens, clots, begins to resist your commands, like a mule refusing to pull the same tired cart one more step. Which is why you make use of your secret stash. You reach beneath your desk and retrieve the small vial of violet-tinged ink you made earlier, the forbidden blend. Still smells faintly like dried flowers and vinegar. You're not using it for official work, of course, just a bit of embellishment, a tiny decorative line under a title, a swirl in the margin, perhaps a miniature almond tree next to a verse from Psalms. This is where the artistry comes in. Byzantine bureaucracy isn't just a machine, it's a mosaic. And every scribe, no matter how lowly, adds their tessera. You think of those tucked-away manuscripts you once saw in the monastic libraries outside Nicomedia? Entire margins filled with little scenes. Soldiers riding snails, bishops arguing with birds, cats chasing angels.
Some say it's sacrilegious, others say it's the soul of the empire leaking out between the lines. Historians still debate how widespread marginalia was in official Byzantine texts. Some believe it was mostly confined to monastic copies of religious works. Others argue that even state documents bore discrete decorative marks, usually erased or scraped off later by more, quote, serious clerks. You suspect it depends entirely on the mood of the scribe and the quality of the ink. Tonight, your mood is excellent. You carefully draw a small fish beneath a tax heading. Symbolic, you reason, since the customs report includes dried sardines. Completely appropriate. You're practically improving the record. Your quill glides along a clean stretch of parchment. You're copying out trade weights and measures from the Black Sea ports. 3 units of wheat to a kantaros, 4 kantaroi to a mule load, adjusted by region and humidity, naturally. Because nothing says administrative elegance like conditional mule math. Still, the notations are important. Standardized weights were the bedrock of Byzantine commerce, and the ink used to record these things had to be trustworthy. 1 drop too faint, and suddenly 2 barrels of honey go unaccounted for, and we can't have that, not when the honey is coming from imperial apiaries. You pause for a moment to admire the clarity of your own handwriting, modest, clean, a little on the narrow side. You've always prided yourself on consistency. You once copied the entirety of Basil's tax code and only made 2 spelling errors. One of them was vinegar, and you maintain that's a stylistic choice, not a mistake. Next to you, someone coughs gently. You glance over. It's Dorian, the junior scribe with perpetually inky sleeves. He's staring at a pile of rejected scrolls, each with blotched lines or faded headings. His ink is wrong, too watery. He looks up with a half-apologetic smile. "I think it curdled," he whispers. You nod solemnly. You stirred clockwise, didn't you? He blushes and mutters something about impatience. You offer him a tiny ladle full of your violet mix. He sniffs it, eyebrows lifting. "This smells like flowers." "And ambition," you add.
He chuckles and returns to work. One more saved soul, courtesy of your aromatic alchemy.
As the scrolls pile up in your outgoing basket, you begin to realize something quietly profound. Ink has moods. It speaks through you, but it also speaks to you. It knows when you're distracted and punishes you with splatters. It knows when you're focused and rewards you with fluid lines and satisfying swirls. Ink is the spirit medium of the state. No law, no edict, no decree would survive without it. And that's not just poetic musing. Ink determined what lasted in this world, who got remembered, who got forgotten. The ink that preserved a marriage record was the same ink that erased someone's debt, or invented it. A flick of the wrist, a darker line, and history turned. Some say the emperor ruled, but you know the truth. The person who stirs the ink at dawn holds the future in a pot, no bigger than a fig.
You stop for a moment, eyes tired. A corner of the scroll flutters in the breeze from an open window. You hear the distant call of a night watchman on the palace wall. Somewhere, a dog barks once, then quiets. You reach for one final scroll. This one is a list of herbal imports destined for the emperor's personal physician. Myrrh, mint, anise, dried apricot pits, slippery elm bark. You copy each item with extra care, knowing that a misplaced comma might result in a very unpleasant potion. You pause at the last entry. Inkberry. You smile. Even the emperor's doctor knows. Nothing in Byzantium runs without ink. Not sermons. Not taxes. Not medicine. Not memory. You write the word again, just because it pleases you. Inkberry. And then you draw a tiny flower beside it. Morning light seeps softly through the lattice windows, casting long, delicate shadows over your desk. The scent of aged parchment mingles with faint traces of jasmine from the courtyard garden below. You take a slow breath, feeling the weight of last night's work settle into your bones. A new day, a fresh set of scrolls, and a persistent itch at the back of your mind. How did all this bureaucracy begin? You dip your quill in ink, your standard black today, safe and steady, and begin to trace the outlines of an ancient story that feels strangely alive even now. The Byzantine bureaucracy, as intricate as the filigree on a palace lamp, didn't materialize overnight. It evolved from centuries of Roman administrative tradition, sprinkled with a dose of Eastern mysticism and practical know-how. Emperors like Constantine and Justinian set the foundations, establishing courts, departments, and codes to keep the sprawling empire in order. The scribes were essential cogs in this vast machine, silent, invisible, but indispensable. Their ink was the lifeblood of imperial governance. You pause to think about the tools themselves. Did you know that Byzantine scribes often preferred goose quills? They offered a balance between flexibility and firmness, ideal for the precise scripts demanded by official documents. Some scribes even favored crow feathers, though those were rare and considered somewhat eccentric, like a baker insisting on hand-milled flour for ordinary bread. Historians still argue whether the increased complexity of bureaucracy was a sign of imperial strength or a symptom of deepening decay. Some see it as a masterstroke of organization, a way to manage a vast, multicultural empire spanning continents and centuries. Others view it as a labyrinthine trap where paperwork piled upon paperwork slowed decisions to a crawl, drowning emperors in their own red tape. You decide to sketch a quick map in the margin, marking the shifting capitals and administrative centers: Constantinople, Thessalonica, Antioch, each a hub buzzing with scribes, inkpots, and imperial edicts. Remember that peculiar ink recipe you read about recently? One that involved not only murex shells, but also a touch of saffron and even powdered gemstones? The theory was that these ingredients gave the ink a shimmer that no other dye could replicate. Some suspect it was as much about showmanship as durability. Imagine presenting a document with sparkling ink, dazzling the recipient into submission before they even read the fine print. Your fingers itch to try a version, but alas, saffron is too precious and powdered lapis lazuli costs more than your yearly salary. You laugh softly and turn your attention back to the scrolls. Today's batch includes records of grain shipments from Egypt and tax exemptions granted to newly established monasteries in Asia Minor. Each line feels like a thread weaving together the empire's vast tapestry. And yet, amidst this order, you know chaos lurks. The empire's borders are under constant threat. Rebellions simmer in distant provinces. Corruption seeps through palace corridors like a silent poison. Still, the ink keeps flowing. It ties promises to parchment and cements the fragile alliances that hold everything together. You dip your quill once more, careful not to blot, and write a simple note to yourself in the margin. Even the finest ink fades, but